A number of issues arise from these considerations. The first concerns the issue of ethics itself. In his later writings, Foucault utilizes the notion of ethics as a general designation for his investigations into the genealogy of our present forms of concern for the self. Foucault, 1979, 1986a, 1986b, C.F. Minson, 1993. Ethical practices for Foucault were distinguished from the domain of morality, in that moral systems are by and large systems of injunctions and interdiction. Thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that, and are most frequently articulated in relation to some relatively formalized code. Ethics, on the other hand, refers to the domain of practical advice as to how one should concern oneself with oneself, make oneself the subject of solicitude and attention, conduct oneself in the world of one's everyday existence. Different cultural periods, Foucault argued, differed in the perspective way that their practices for the regulation of conduct placed upon codified moral injunctions and the practical repertories of ethical advice. However, one might undertake a genealogy of our contemporary ethical regime, which Foucault suggested encouraged human beings to relate to themselves as the subject of asexuality, and were enjoined to know themselves through a hermeneutics of the self, to explore, discover, reveal, and live in the light of the desires that comprised one's truth. Such a genealogy will disturb the appearance of enlightenment which clothed such a regime by exploring the way in which certain forms of spiritual practice, which could be found in Greek, Roman, and early Christian ethics, had become incorporated into priestly power, and later into the practices of the educational, medical, and psychological type. Foucault, 1986a. Clearly, the approach I have outlined above has derived much from Foucault's arguments of these issues. However, I will wish to develop this argument in a number of respects. First, as has been pointed out elsewhere, the notion of techniques of the self can be somewhat misleading. The self does not form the transhistorical object of techniques of being human, but only one way in which humans have been enjoined to understand and relate to themselves. Hadot, 1992. In different practices, these relations are cast in terms of individuality, character, constitution, reputation, personality, and the like, which are neither merely different versions of a self, nor do they sum into a self. Further, they exceed the extent to which our contemporary relation to ourselves, inwardness, self-exploration, self-fulfillment, and the like, does indeed take the issue of sexuality and desire, as its fulcrum must remain an open question for historical investigation. Elsewhere, I have suggested that the self itself has become the object of valorization, a regime of subjectification in which desire has become freed from its dependence upon the law of an inner sexuality and been transformed into a variety of passions to discover and realize the identity of the self itself. Rose 1989. Further, I will suggest one needs to extend an analysis of the relations between government and subjectification beyond the field of ethics. If by that one means all those styles of relating to oneself that are structured by the divisions of true and falsity, the permitted and the forbidden. One needs to examine also the government of this relation along some other axes. One of the axes concerns the attempt to inculcate a certain relation to oneself through transformations in mentalities, or what one might term intellectual techniques, reading, memory, writing, numeracy, and so forth. See for some powerful examples, Einstein 1997 and Godi and Watt 1963. For example, especially over the course of the 19th century in Europe and the United States, one sees the development of a host of projects of the transformation of the intellect in the service of particular objectives, each of which seeks to enjoy a particular relation to the self through the implantation of certain capacities of reading, writing, and calculating. One example here will be the way in which in the latter decades of the 19th century, Republican educators in the United States promoted numeracy, in particular the numerical capacities that they argued would be facilitated by the decimalization in order to generate a particular kind of relation to themselves and their world in those so equipped. A number itself will be a calculating self who will establish a prudent relation to the future, to building, to budgeting, to trade, to politics, and to life conduct in general. Klein Cohen, 1982. A second axis will concern corporealities or body techniques. Of course, anthropologists and others have remarked upon the cultural shaping of bodies, comportment, expression of emotion, and the like as they differ from culture to culture, and within cultures between genders, ages, status groups, and the like. Marcel Mauss provides the classical account of the ways in which the body as a technical instrument is organized differently in different cultures, different ways of walking, sitting, digging, marching, and so forth. However, a genealogy of subjectification is not concerned with the general problem of the cultural relativity of bodily capacities, but with the ways in which different corporeal regimes have been devised and implanted in rationalized attempts to enjoy a particular relation to the self and to others. Norbert Elias has given many powerful examples of the ways in which explicit codes of bodily conduct, manners, etiquette, and the self-monitoring of bodily functions and actions were enjoined upon individuals in different positions within the apparatus of the court. Elias 1983, Elias 1978, Osborne 1996. Foucault's own studies of the asylum and the prison explore programs in which the disciplining of the body of the pathological individuals not only involved the catching up of that body within an external regime of hierarchical surveillance and normalizing judgment. and the imbrication of the body in a molecular regime governing movement in time and space, but also sought to enjoy an internal relation between the paradoxical, the pathological individual and his or her body, in which bodily comportment will both manifest and maintain a certain disciplined mastery exercised by the person over themselves. Foucault, 1977. See also Smith, 1992, for a history of the notion of inhibition and its relation to the manifestation of steadfastness and self-mastery through the exercise of control over the body. And analogous, those substantively very different relation to the body was a key element in the self-sculpting of a certain aesthetic persona in 19th century Europe, embodied in certain styles of dress, but also in the cultivation of certain body techniques, such as swimming, that would produce and display a particular relation to the natural. Sprouson, 1992. Historians of gender have begun to analyze the ways in which the appropriate performance of sexual identity has historically been linked to the inculcation of certain regimes of the body. Butler, 1990. Certain ways of holding oneself, walking, running, holding the head, and positioning the limbs are not merely culturally relative or acquired through gender socialization, but are regimes of the body which seek to subjectify it in terms of a certain true or gender. Inscribing a particular relation to oneself in a corporeal regime, prescribed, rationalized, and taught in manuals of advice, etiquette, and manners, and enjoined by sanctions as well as seductions. These comments should indicate something of the heterogeneity of the links between the government of others and the government of the self. It is important to stress two further aspects of his heterogeneity. The first concerns the diversity of modes in which a certain relation to oneself is enjoined. There is a temptation to stress the elements of self-mastery and restrictions over one's desires and instincts that are entitled in many the regimes of subjectification. The injunction to control or civilize an inner nature that is excessive. Certainly, one can see this theme in many 19th century debates of ethics and character for both the ruling order and in the respectable laboring classes. A paradoxical despotism of the self at the heart of liberal doctrines of liberty of the subject. I derived this formulation from Valverde, 1996. But there are many other modes in which this relation to oneself can be established, and even within the exercise of mastery, a variety of configurations through which one can be encouraged to master oneself. To master one's will in the service of character by the inculcation of habits and rituals through self-denial. Prudence and foresight, for example, is different from mastering one's desire by bringing its roots to awareness through a reflexive hermeneutics in order to free oneself from the self-destructive consequences of repression, projection, and identification. Further, the very form of the relation can vary. It can be one of knowledge, as in the injunction to know oneself, which Foucault traces back to the Christian confession and forward to the techniques of psychotherapeutics. Here, the codes of knowledge are inevitably supplied not by pure introspection but by rendering one's introspection in a particular vocabulary or feeling, of feelings, beliefs, passions, desires, values, or whatever, and according to a particular explanatory code derived from some source of authority. Or it can be one of concern and solicitude, and as in contemporary projects for the care of the self, in which the self is to be nurtured, protected, safeguarded by regimes of diet, stress minimization, and self-esteem. Equally, the relation to authority can vary. Consider, for example, some of the changing authority configurations in the government or of madness and mental health. The relation of mastery that was exercised between asylum doctor and mad person in late 18th century moral medicine. The relation of discipline and institutional authority that obtained between the 19th century asylum doctor and the inmate, the relation of pedagogy that obtained between the mental hygienists of the first half of the 20th century and the children and parents, pupils and teachers, workers and managers, generals and soldiers, upon whom they sought to act, the relation of seduction, conversion, and exemplarity that obtains between the psychotherapist and the client today. As will be evident from the above discussion, whilst the relations to oneself enjoined at any one historical moment may resemble one another in various ways. For example, the Victorian notion of character was widely dispersed across many different practices. The extent to which this is the case in a matter for empirical investigation. It is not a matter, therefore, of narrating a general history of the idea of the person or self, but of tracing the technical forms accorded to the relation to oneself in various practices: legal, military, industrial, familial, economic. And even within many practices, heterogeneity must be assumed to more common than homogeneity. Consider, for example, the very different configurations of personhood in the legal apparatus at any one moment. The difference between the notion of status and reputation as it functioned in civil proceedings in the 19th century, and the simultaneous elaboration of a new relation to the lawbreaker as a pathological personality in the criminal courts and the prison system. Pasquino, 1991. In our own present is marked by a certain leveling of these differences, such that presuppositions concerning human beings in diverse practices share a certain family resemblance. Humans are subjects of autonomy, equipped with a psychology aspiring to self-fulfillment and actually or potentially running their lives as a kind of enterprise or of themselves. Then this is precisely the point of departure for a genealogical investigation. In that ways was this regime of the self put together, under what conditions and in relation to what demands and forms of authority. We have certainly seen a proliferation of expertises of human conduct over the last 100 years. Economists, managers, accountants, lawyers, counselors, therapists, medics, anthropologists, political scientists, social policy experts, and the like. But I will argue that the unification of regimes of subjectification has much to do with the rise of one particular form of positive expertise of human being, that of the psi disciplines and their generosity. But their generosity, I mean that contrary to conventional views of the exclusivity of professional knowledge, psi has been happy, inner eager to give itself away, to lend its vocabularies, explanations, and types of judgment to other professional groups and to implant them within its clients. Rose 1992b. The psi disciplines, partly as a consequence of their heterogeneity and lack of a single paradigm, have acquired a peculiar penetrative capacity in relation to practices for the conduct. They have been able to supply a whole variety of models of selfhood and recipes for action in relation to the government of person by professionals in different locals. Their potency has been increased by their ability to supplement these practicable qualities with a legitimacy deriving from their claims to tell the truth about human beings. They have disseminated themselves further through their really translatability into programs for reshaping the self-steering mechanisms of individuals. It is, of course, true that the psi disciplines are not held publicly in particularly high esteem, and their practitioners are often figures of fun, but one should not be misled by this. It has become impossible to conceive of personhood, to experience one's own or another's personhood, or to govern oneself or other without psi.